Now let us begin by tracing the way that rational creatures participate in the Beatitude of the incarnate Christ. That is found principally in Thomas's theology of the Eucharist, to which we now turn. The Eucharist, the sacrament of Beatitude. The Eucharist, according to Thomas, is the prolongation of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ to the Father on the cross of Calvary. In Christ's own self-sacrifice on the cross, he returned in his deified humanity to the Father, and it is in the Eucharist that the Church, A, participates in his deified humanity, and B, returns to the Father in his sacrifice substantially contained in the Mass. That's the twofold summary of the theology of the Eucharist. It is the sacrament of Beatitude. It is the sacrament of Reditus. It is the sacrament of Reditus. The Eucharist is at the center of Roman Catholic religion, because it is by the Eucharist that Christ's deified flesh deifies the Church in a sacramental mystery. It is to the Eucharist you must look if you want to understand the religious epicenter of Thomas's system of theology. Thomas's most basic religious propensions, his most primitive or foundational conception of religion, appears in the Eucharist. Lawrence Feingold, in his trenchant work entitled The Eucharist, Mystery of Present Sacrifice and Communion, draws out the organic connection between the deification of Jesus' humanity in his incarnation and the deification of the Church as she participates in the prolongation of his incarnation and in the prolongation of his sacrifice in the Eucharist. He says this, page 20. The principal end of the incarnation is to give us an incomparable, inconceivable gift, which is to share in God's own divine nature through incorporation into Christ's mystical body. He then cites the so-called blessed exchange formula from certain patristic theologians, quote, God became man so as to give us a sharing in his divinity, page 21. He even cites from Thomas himself, quote, the only begotten Son of God, wishing to enable us to share in his divinity, assumed our nature so that by becoming man he might make men gods. That's the Liturgy of the Hours, the Feast of Corpus Christi. Feingold is quick to note that, quote, this divinization of man does not mean that man takes the place of God. God cannot lose his throne or his divine majesty. On the contrary, the divinization of man is the transformation of man into the full image and likeness of God through the gift of sanctifying grace and supernatural charity. End of quote. Feingold then adds, the divine wisdom determined that all grace after Adam's fall should come to us through the incarnation, end quote. And that the end of the incarnation is, quote, to clothe man in the divine garments of sanctifying grace and supernatural charity and bring him to the beatific vision of God in heaven, 21. Feingold then makes explicit the connection between the incarnation and the Eucharist in Thomas's theology. He says, quote, the Eucharist is intimately connected with this primary end of the incarnation, the divinization of man, and the giving of sanctifying grace by incorporating him into his mystical body, page 23. So while the Eucharist is not the only channel of grace, it is the principal channel for the increase of grace and the nourishing of grace and charity, for that is its reason for being. It is the sacrament of divinization. End of quote. I call it the sacrament of Beatitude. It's the same thing. Feingold goes on to say, in the incarnation, Christ became a partaker of our manhood, assuming as human nature to his divine person. In the Eucharist, Christ gives us his humanity to be our nourishment, so that our humanity, receiving his, may be nourished by his divinity. He says further that, quote, Christ's humanity made substantially present in the Eucharist is the perfect bridge to give us a progressive share in his divinity. The Eucharist is the divine means to realize and perfect the divine interchange by which he took on our humanity and gives us a mysterious share in his divine life. In sum, the Eucharist continues the logic of the Incarnation, since it is a prolongation of the Incarnation itself. Now let me stop and simply comment on that point. I hope this is apparent, that if you retrieve Thomas's theology of the processions, if you retrieve Thomas's theology of the missions, you are in the same movement retrieving his theology of Christ and sacrament. Because the incarnation of Christ is the realization of the Trinitarian mission of the Son in the grace of the union and the Trinitarian mission of the Spirit in habitual grace. And the sacrament of the Eucharist is the communication of that mission to the church, deifying the church as Christ himself was deified in the hypostatic union. It's a system. It is a system of entailments. It's a system of deep structures. In fact, for Thomas, the Eucharist, quote, alone contains the substantial presence of Christ and his sacrifice, so that, quote, the other sacraments are all ordered to the Eucharist as their source and end. Page 32. Thomas says, quote, absolutely speaking, the sacrament of the Eucharist is the greatest of all the sacraments because it contains Christ himself substantially, whereas the other sacraments contain a certain instrumental power, which is a share of Christ's power, as we have shown above. That's from ST 3, 65, 3, question 65, answer 3. As such, Thomas says the sacrament is both a sacrifice and a sacrament. It has the nature of sacrifice inasmuch as it is offered up. It has the nature of sacrament inasmuch as it is received. And therefore, it has the effect of a sacrament in the recipient and the effect of a sacrifice in the offerer or in them for whom it is offered. What is he saying? He's saying that in the Mass, in the Eucharist, the sacrifice of Jesus is substantially contained. The deified flesh of Jesus Christ is substantially communicated in the sacrament of divinization. And all other sacraments are ordered to the Eucharist. It becomes the epicenter by which the Trinitarian missions of deifying grace are communicated to and received by the Church. In his liturgical office on the Feast of Corpus Christi, commissioned by the Pope for him to write, Thomas reasoned as follows, quote, because the flesh of Christ is united to the Word of God, his flesh is life-giving, thus his body, sacramentally received, is also life-giving. For Christ gives life to the world through the mysteries that he accomplished in his flesh. He says next, he shows that even his flesh is life-giving, for it is the instrument of his divinity. And since an instrument acts by the power of the agent, then just as the divinity of Christ is life-giving, so too does his flesh give life by the power of the Word to which it is united. What he is saying here pertains to the sharing of his body to the sacrament of the Eucharist. You see, Thomas denies that Christ's flesh is life-giving in itself. The flesh of Christ does not have the intrinsic power to deify the church. The principal or efficient cause of our deification is the divine nature, and the instrumental cause is the deified humanity of Christ. Through sacramental participation in the deified humanity of Christ, the church is deified. The flesh of Jesus was hypostatically joined to the divine person of the Logos and deified by the grace of union. And in the Eucharist, the deified flesh of Christ deifies us. As one theologian has put it succinctly, through the Eucharist, the deified flesh of Jesus Christ deifies us. Now, to talk about Thomas's view of the Eucharist, I need to accent this one last time. Thomas views the Eucharist as the sacrifice of Christ himself. It is not a repetition. It is the sacrifice of Christ. For Thomas, an offering or sacrifice symbolizes the sinner's return to God in sacrifice. Sacrifice has two aspects: the thing given to God and the invisible thing that the sacrifice symbolizes, the gift of self. Jesus' visible sacrifice on Calvary is a visible sign of his invisible return to the Father. Jesus gave himself to the Father on the cross in his reditus to the Father. And so Jesus' sacrifice is not simply a reditus to the Father, it is the reditus to the Father. It is not an act of worship, it is the supreme act of worship. To quote from a lecture that was given in Reformed Forum's theology conference in 2018, by definition, reditus in grace is the essence of religion. And Jesus' reditus on the cross is the supreme reditus to the Father and therefore the quintessential act of worship. The climactic reditus of humanity in grace simply is the incarnation of Jesus Christ as that humanity returns to God in sacrifice. And the Eucharist is the prolongation of that sacrifice, and the Eucharist is the means by which the church participates in that sacrifice and is returned to God. Jesus' self-sacrifice, substantially contained and communicated in the Eucharist, is the very essence of religion for Thomas. Why? Because it focuses his processional theology and the invisible missions in its communication to the church. You can't separate Thomas's theology of the Eucharist from his theology of divine and human procession in exitus and in reditus. The Eucharist is the sacrament that communicates the graced participation of Jesus' deified humanity, by which he knows the Father as the Father knows himself, by which he loves the Father as the Father loves himself in the eternal processions. Thomas's system demands this notion of transubstantiation because it is the way by which humanity returns to God in Jesus. Graced, reproportioned, deified to know God as God knows himself and love God as God loves himself. In it, Christ's reproportioned humanity returned to the Father in sacrifice is gifted to the church as the church participates in Jesus' reditus. You see, the system is a closed system. The system is an organic system. This is the genius of Thomas. This is why when I began these lectures, I noted he is among the great systematic minds in the history of the Christian tradition, and for that I admire him. But he is the architect of the deeper Catholic conception that you find at Trent and you find in the highest and purest expressions of traditional Roman Catholic theology. Now let's move briefly, because this has been contained in various ways in all of the lectures. Let's move briefly to the Beatitude of the rational creature in the return to God, the light of glory. And I'm not going to spend as much time on this as you might expect, because we have already treated it when we spoke of the image of God earlier in the previous lecture. But Darius Pisano has a very useful book entitled The Glory of God's Grace, Deification According to St. Thomas Aquinas. And she summarizes very crisply and nicely the main contours of Thomas's account of the Visio Dei, of Beatitude. As Beatitude conforms the rational creature to the personal properties of the Son in knowledge and the Spirit in love. You see, this pattern just so far has been noted by whom? It's clearly taught by Thomas. It's masterfully summarized in its Trinitarian expression by Emery. It's given further elaboration in the work of Legge and Levering and Feingold. And now we see it appearing again in the work of Pisano. She says this: Adam's natural powers of intellect and will are incapable of attaining supernatural beatitude on their own. But also human nature, as their source, is itself radically insufficient, ontologically underproportioned for eternal life, and so incapable of producing the acts necessary to get there. That's the Glory of God's Grace 31 and 32. She goes on to say, Thomas teaches, quote, the essence of God itself becomes for the intellect the medium of the beatific vision, playing the role of species by informing the intellect. The reproportioning of the created intellect by the light of glory disposes it for union with the divine essence, making it perfectible by the divine essence as form by giving it a higher potency suitable for such a higher actualization. Now let me just note this and connect this with what we've seen in the past. What is Pisano saying? She's saying this, that in the light of nature, the created intellect knows God indirectly and inferentially through created objects, through sensible objects. The knowledge is inferential and derived. What Pisano is saying is that when the reproportioning by grace ultimately conforms the intellect to the divine processions to see the essence, there is an immediate intellective apprehension of the essence, an immediate love for that essence that no longer is mediated through sensible objects. It is a union with the divine essence itself, as that essence processes in the Son as knowledge and the Spirit as love. See, the movement of the Reditus to God, according to Pisano, is a sacerdotal movement, an ontological ascent construed as a process of increasing similitude to God, in, quote, increasingly perfect participation of the creature in the light of the divine intellect, resulting more and more perfect likeness to God. The increase of end of quote. The increase of rational similitude is a participation in the personal property of the Son, which we've seen. The increase of participation in charity and affection for the divine essence manifests participation in the personal property of the Spirit. Knowing the Father's essence as the Son knows that essence, loving the Father's essence as the Spirit loves that essence, that is what is given in the light of glory. And Thomas, and I've already commented on this in the deeper Protestant conception of natural theology, but Thomas himself says, accordingly, in the heavenly vision, there will be no third medium, so that, to wit, God will be known by images of other things, as he is known now. For which reason we are said to see now in a glass, nor will there be a second medium, because the essence of God himself will be that whereby our intellect will see God. There will be only the first medium, which will upraise our intellect so that it will be possible for it to be united to the uncreated substance in the aforesaid manner. Yet this medium will not cause that knowledge to be mediate, because it does not come in between the knower and the thing known, but is that which gives the knower the power to know. End of quote. Thomas taught that sanctifying grace ultimately enables an immediate and direct intellective apprehension of and love for the essence of God in the light of glory, as that essence becomes the medium by which the intellect views God, apprehends God's glory. And this means, quite simply, that as we come to know God in the light of glory, the rational creature is given a share in the Son's own intellective apprehension of the essence in filiation, of the Spirit's own love for the essence in the act of spiration. The intellective generation of the Son is his perfect knowledge of the Father's essence, and that knowledge is direct and immediate. That is what is conferred upon the intellect of the rational creature in the light of glory. The effective generation of the Spirit entails his perfect and immediate love for the Father's essence along with the Son. And that is what is conferred upon the rational creature in the light of glory. The rational creature's participation in the essence of God in the light of glory bears this inalienable processional character. In the light of glory, the rational creature is reproportioned to the personal properties of the Son and the Spirit in a direct, intellective, and effective apprehension of the essence of God, bringing to pass the eschatological term of the missions, granting the rational creature a share in the divine processions themselves. This is of the essence of Thomism, a sharing in the essence as it proceeds in the intellective and volitional processions of the Son as knowledge and the Spirit as love. Now this gives us, what we've done up to this point in the course, this gives us a proper vantage point to ask and answer how we ought to think about the relation of the deeper Protestant conception to the deeper Catholic conception of Thomas, and it gives us a window into how we can assess the current movement of retrieval underway among some Protestants. For those interested in retrieving Thomas and his theology, incorporating it into a Reformed system of theology, we need to remember at least a couple of points that are critical by way of preface. This is in addition to what I've said so far in these lectures. On April 15th in 1567, Pope Pius V made Thomas Aquinas a doctor of the Church, a doctor of the Roman Catholic Church. A doctor of the Church is someone who has made a perennial contribution to the Church's theology. And to be a doctor in the Church is therefore the highest honor that can be bestowed upon a theologian. And this was done in 1567, just 4 years after the closing of the Council of Trent. And Pope Pius V was himself a Dominican friar, just like Thomas, and next to Robert Bellarmine was one of the leading Thomistic theologians of his day. And prior to his papacy, he had an important role in the Council of Trent. During his papacy, he commissioned the works of Thomas to be published, the Opera Omni, and he said of Thomas that he was the most brilliant light of the church, quote, and that his illumination has often been helpful in the past and recently stood forth prominently in the decrees of the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent, according to Pope Pius V, was in essence a revival of Thomism, in direct, self-conscious opposition to the Protestant Reformation in Calvin and Luther and the rest. That point needs to be kept in mind as we assess Thomas's theology. Now, when you join that assessment to everything we've done, demonstrating that all of Thomas's theology is theology proper, his theology of eternal processions, temporal processions, the economy of creation, the economy of grace, the nature of the incarnation, the nature of the Eucharist, the character of Beatitude, all of his theology is circumscribed by exitus and reditus, and it is one of the most ingeniously coherent systems in the history of the Christian tradition. Now, just in light of that, it might strike you as hard to fathom that some Reformed thinkers, such as Matthew Barrett in The Reformation as Renewal, have sought to retrieve Thomas's theology and integrate it into a system of Reformed theology. Barrett follows the Jesuit theologian of Rome, John Patrick Donnelly, who first introduced the term Calvinist Thomist in the late 1970s, the Reformed historian of doctrine Richard Muller, and the historical reassessment of Thomas and the Reformation found in the works of Steinmetz, Obermann, and others. Now, the goal of those who want to retrieve Thomas is to take those elements in his system that are compatible with Reformed theology, reject the rest, and then synthesize his insights into a Reformed system of doctrine. The result of such work is usually what is meant by Reformed Thomism. Now, it's not my goal at all to comment in detail either on that attempt to retrieve Thomas in general, with Donnelly and Muller and Steinmetz and Obermann and others, nor do I want to critique Barrett's work in the Reformation as Renewal in particular, in any extensive way. Without quoting Barrett extensively or without seeking to offer a comprehensive critique of his work, with much more to be said, let me make a few observations that can correct what I think is lacking in his presentation and enable a more responsible and nuanced engagement with Thomas, and open up the authentic path to interact meaningfully with his system that we've surveyed. First, Barrett is correct when he observes that, following the work of Obermann and Steinmetz, that Thomas admirably opposed voluntarism, as did Luther and the Reformation. The problems of Bardianism, dipolar theism, open theism, the current rise of biblicism and mutualism in the work of Clark Pinnock, Bruce Ware, and Scott Oliphant, among others, are most certainly instances of voluntarism, the adoption of voluntarist premises. What are those premises, or what is the central premise? God, on all of these views, the Bardian, dipolar, open theist, and its evangelical offspring and Pinnock, Ware, and Oliphant, on all of these views, God changes in and is determined by his relation to creatures. While God might be simple, immutable, and impassible apart from his relation to creation, he sovereignly wills himself to be composite, mutable, and passible in his relation to creation. Each of these views, no matter their differences, rest on a view that Voss and Van Til would term as pantheistic. If you've had earlier lectures in the Van Til modules, you know what that means, but it means God is submerged in a mutual change along with the creature. That is the quintessence of a voluntarist conception of God in relation to creatures. Barrett and many other retrievalists are correct that all such dialectical and dipolar constructions are contrary to biblical teaching, contrary to the ecumenical creeds, contrary to Reformed theology, and have no place in such. Such views, as we named earlier, the Bardian, the dipolar, the open theist, the evangelical offspring of Pinnock, Ware, and Oliphant, these views align with the Socinian or neo-Hegelian understanding of God in relation to creation, rather than the biblical and Reformed doctrine of an absolute and immutable tripersonal creator. So I want to commend Barrett by noting that Thomas laudably opposes what I call front door mutualism, the idea that God reproportions his eternal being and in his divine personhood to the mutable developmental ignorance and becoming of the creature. Thomas admirably rejected that, as did the Reformers. But Barrett is not so helpful when he leverages Thomas's opposition to voluntarism in ways that obscure the deep structures of Thomas's system. Thomas's anti-voluntarism is an intellectualist expression of sacerdotalism that risks the inverse error of voluntarism, that risks the inverse error of front door mutualism. Let me explain. While Thomas admirably avoids the problems of what I call front door mutualism, the voluntarist doctrine that God sovereignly reproportions his personal mode of existence to the becoming of the creature in order to interact with the creature, Thomas substitutes in its place a backdoor mutualism. The traditional Roman Catholic doctrine that God graciously reproportions the becoming of the creature to the eternal mode of immutable Trinitarian persons in the divine processions. Backdoor mutualism, as I've termed it in the book on Van Til. So while for Thomas, God does not sovereignly reproportion his being and his triune personhood to the mode of creaturely becoming, he does explicitly reproportion the creature's becoming to the mode of the divine being as communicated in the eternal processions. Backdoor mutualism, the assimilation of the creature's becoming to God's own being through reproportioning grace, is not the Reformed answer to front door mutualism. It is not the Reformed answer to voluntarism. It is instead the traditional Roman Catholic answer to voluntarism. And if you want a sketch of the Reformed answer to both front door and backdoor mutualism, please work through the modules in Reformed Academy on Van Til, and take time, if you're so inclined, to read my book on the Trinitarian Theology of Cornelius Van Til, where I make that case. Second, Thomas's doctrine of the image of God and his notions of created and uncreated grace, his weakened conception of original sin, his inability to affirm the imputation of righteousness in justification, his theology of the incarnation as instant deification, his insistence that the Eucharist is the sacrifice of Christ that deifies rational creatures by transubstantiation, and his advocacy of what Bavinck called a melting union in the beatific vision, all of these interrelated doctrines express his theology proper of the rational creature's participation in the essence of God in exitus and reditus. All of those doctrines that I just named are entailments of and expressions of theology proper. All of them are instances and exemplars of Thomas's theology of the creature's participation in the processions of God through the invisible missions of the Son and Spirit, brought to fruition, to climax in the Incarnation and applied in the Eucharist. Every doctrine in Thomas' system expresses the temporal mission of the Son and Spirit as they confer deifying grace that elevates and returns the temporal creature above his nature to share in eternal processions themselves. I find this insight entirely missing in Barrett's treatment of Thomas. He hits isolated incidental features of Thomas, such as his anti-voluntarism, but he nowhere sets forth the fullness of his Trinitarian theology in its systematic genius. Third, while Barrett helpfully distinguishes the Dominican Thomistic and the Franciscan Scotus conceptions of superadded grace, he does not usefully pinpoint their common commitment to something supernaturally added to Adam above and beyond his creation that sets them over against Reformed theology. Clearly, he does not do that clearly. Let me explain. The difference that Barrett helpfully notes between the Dominican Thomistic and Franciscan Scotist conceptions of superadded grace is helpful. He says this: for the Thomist, the donum superadditum was superadded grace, quote unquote, or grace given above and beyond the work of special creation, yet, quote, was part of the original human constitution, end quote. In other words, the donum superadditum for Thomas was a supernatural gift, supernaturally added to Adam as the image of God, but given at the same time the image endowment was given to him. The superadded grace is, according to Barrett for Thomas, logically distinct yet temporally identical to Adam's creation as the image of God. The distinction is a logical but not temporal distinction. I believe Barrett is correct about that. But Scotus, by contrast, according to Barrett, quote, so severed the two, natural image endowment and superadded grace, so severed the two in time that he conditioned superadded grace on man's merit, thereby opening himself up to the charge of Pelagianism, end quote. For Scotus, the superadded grace is temporally distinct from Adam's creational image endowment, given at a later time, and merited by Adam's autonomous obedience, which is Pelagian. So the distinction between image endowment in nature and superadded grace is a temporal one and brings into view the problem of intrinsic creaturely merit. So that's helpful. Let me tell you what I find not as helpful. Both the Thomist and the Scotus believed that grace was superadded. Both believed that grace was superadded above and beyond what was given in the work of special creation simpliciter. In other words, both the Thomist and the Franciscans believed that the donum superadditum was not concreated but superadded. They both believed that. He even notes this on page 149, that the Reform insisted that the gift of original righteousness was concreated and given in the original human constitution itself. But then he says, in passing, quote, the difference between the superadded gift, Thomism, and concreated gift is not insignificant, but both camps were an ally against Scotism and later Occam and Beale. See chapter 5. That's from page 149. Now, while it's true that neither Thomas nor the Reformed believed that superadded grace could be merited, we must be emphatic and clear on something. While both denied that the image-bearing creature can merit reward, can merit blessing by his own intrinsic resources, apart from covenant, apart from superadded grace. What we must insist on and keep in mind at every point is that Thomas denied and the Reformed affirmed concreated righteousness, righteousness that is not superadded. And this point lies at the heart of their differences when it comes to a number of doctrines. The Reformed affirm concreated original righteousness. The Roman Catholic, like Thomas, denies it. The Reformed affirm the imputation of Adam's original guilt under the covenant of works and the imputation of Christ's righteousness and forensic justification under the covenant of grace. The Roman Catholic and Thomas denies it. The entire nexus of Reformed doctrines of image, covenant, sin, imputation, and justification sola fide hinge on the critical distinction between concreated versus superadded gifts of righteousness. The debates between the Thomists and Scotists on the timing of superadded righteousness are therefore in-house debates of those who both affirm superadded grace being necessary to complete what is natural in man. They simply differ on the timing of such grace. The difference between Thomas and Scotus is the difference between the timing of such grace that is superadded and whether or not it's merited. But they both agree on what? The fact that grace must be superadded to supplement what is deficient in nature. Yet both the Thomists and the Scotists stand united over against all of the Reformed who affirm concreated righteousness and the system of doctrine that flows from it, covenant theology, and the imputation of righteousness. Barrett, while he'll note in passing that the differences between the superadded gift and the concreated gift are not insignificant, he does not develop that significance of that difference, the significance of that difference. He so tries to ally Thomas and the Reformed against the Scotists that he misses the more basic commonality between Thomas and the Scotists in that both affirm superadded grace. The Reformed have denied it. Fourth, and this is a segue to what I'm about to discuss, there is a better way to speak of the nature of Trinitarian processions, the role of Trinitarian missions, the nature of the image-bearing creature, the need for the covenant of works, the character of the incarnation, the work of Christ under the covenant of grace, the application of redemption and union with Christ, its sacramental signification and sealing, and the nature of eschatology. And that better way is found in the Reformed federalism of what Voss called the deeper Protestant conception, or the integration of Reformed Trinitarianism and Reformed federalism in what Van Til called the representational principle. As Thomas shaped his doctrine of the Trinity in light of his own sacerdotal anthropology, his conceptions of nature and grace, so we should continue to shape our Trinitarian theology in light of our own covenant anthropology. Doctrine of the image of God, natural religious fellowship, original righteousness, and covenantal condescension, without any need for superadded grace, whether gifted, Thomas, or merited, Scotus. The integration of Reformed Trinitarianism, processions in relation to missions, and federalism, a Reformed doctrine of image and covenantal condescension, requires our urgent and intensive attention as we develop the deeper Protestant conception of the creator-creature relation and extend it to every theological locus from Trinitarian processions to the Church's Beatitude. And my prayer is that we will begin to do so in self-conscious awareness of the profound differences between the Thomistic and traditional Roman Catholic system of Trinitarian theology and a Calvinistic or Reformed system of Trinitarian theology, which Voss termed a deeper Protestant conception, which Van Til termed the representational principle, the comprehensive self-conscious integration of Reformed Trinitarianism and Reformed federalism, opposing all forms of front door and backdoor mutualism. That is our way forward.